the hunger stats you're looking at today are going to pale in comparison to tomorrow because of climate change.
That's Keely Wachs, the Vice President of Communications and Impact at Zume, who's helping to reduce food waste by creating more efficient supply chains.
It's a long-term play, but it's the way you have to be thinking about these systems. Our CEO likes to talk about systems designing and building a company smart from the start and being a systems thinker, right? So, and the reason he feels compelled to do that is because of climate change and the urgency around that problem. So he's like, Keely, Amazon was built over 25 years. We don't have the luxury of that.
What does the future of leadership look like in the food industry? Find out and listen to this episode of the Leaders Podcast, your number one source for impact leaders harnessing capitalism to help sustain the planet, people, and profits. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And welcome, everyone, to the Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Edwards. Alongside us today, joining us from Oakland, California, is Keely Wachs, the Vice President of Communications and Impact at Zume, that's developing technology for a larger and smarter, sustainable food system. Keely, thanks for coming on the show today.
Hey, Kevin. So really, really honored to be here.
It's an honor to have you here, Keely, because when I was doing research for this podcast, this company, I was like, man, this is a solution that can exponentially, solve some of the world's global food supply and distribution problems. So before we kind of get into all the problematic stuff, all the process stuff, would you mind telling myself and your audience a little bit of your background, your upbringing, your story, your childhood, and why you're so invested into a company like this?
Yeah, sure. That's a big question. I'm humbled by the question. I feel really lucky. I feel super fortunate to be able to do something that I love to do, and for a company that I love to do it for, and to be able to go to work every day and say we're trying to solve something big, and to be able to go to work every day and inspire a team across the organization to help address a really big problem, which is climate change. And we're doing that through food waste. It's an amazing business, actually. So food waste, actually, if it was its own country, would be the third largest emitter of carbon emissions in the world after China and the US. So, food waste is problematic in a lot of ways, but it's also a huge lever for addressing climate change. And so, our founder is a brilliant guy, and he has this really elegant way of looking at the world, which he thinks that the food system, supply and demand, are out of balance, and that we overproduce because we know there's a bunch of waste in the system. So that if we could actually create demand signals and better connect from demand all the way down to supply using technology, that we would help be able to address some, if not all, of the waste that goes into the food system. And the food system is wasteful in two ways, right? It's both the food that's produced and never consumed, but it's also the packaging, the way it's transported. And so we are looking at all these amazing technological solutions to help address that. What brought me here was I actually, I didn't study food. I didn't study tech. I came into my career funny way, which was, as I tell people that either are on my team or that ask me, like, how do you get in your career? I said, I just kind of kept learning and followed passion. And so it led me to graduate school where I studied environmental economics. And then that led me into actually working in clean energy, which I did for more than a decade. I was really, really lucky to be at the forefront of that movement. And then the food industry was the next really interesting channel and challenge for me. So, I'm super lucky, and I'm having a blast.
Well, we're super happy to have you on the show, Keely. And you made a couple of good points there. One, your founder, he believes in this food system can be changed to really have an impact. Is capitalism a system? Is society a system that can be changed and updated and evolved? And maybe what are your thoughts on that since you've been working at Zume?
Yeah, it's funny. He and I were actually just talking about this the other day. And look, I think capitalism as a system works, but it needs checks and balances. And it's here to stay. I don't think we're going to see a world without capitalism, at least not for a long, long time. But I think what we are seeing is capitalism evolving. And, it takes probably slower than many of us would like, but capitalism is moving from a system that was primarily driven by one metric, right, which is profitability, making money. And now we're seeing a system that's evolving to account for some of those other really important metrics, whether they're human, social, or environmental. And we're starting to see what started probably 20, 25 years ago, kind of in corporate America. We're starting to really see that ground itself in practical ways, right? So and an example of this is like one of the largest growth areas in investing is in ESG, right? Environmental social governance. And large amounts of funds are starting to be created to invest in companies like ours and others that are not just looking at the financial rewards or financial outcomes of a company, but they're also looking at some of these other benefits. And I think what's exciting about that is, at the nascent stages, so companies are investors, funds, family foundations, others are saying, look, we want to put money into companies that we think are going to be successful financially, but that are also doing these other things. But what's starting to happen now is we're starting to get a greater link between those environmental and social outcomes and profitability. And so whereas before it was kind of a feel-good investment strategy, we said, look, there's a big trend here. It feels good for us to be making some investments. Let's do the bare minimum to make sure that these organizations are actually getting the environmental and social benefits that are stated in their purpose, to now actually linking performance across those different categories in ways that we haven't seen before. And you can see a day where not only will there be high correlation between profitability and those environmental and social outcomes, but we're gonna start to see companies, investment firms, others really looking to those environmental and social metrics as the lead over profitability. I think it's going to take time, but I think we're starting to see that.
Well, it's good to hear. What I find so interesting about Zume is not even just the philanthropic idea of it. Obviously, the packaging is sustainable now. I saw it was made out of sugarcane. But the bigger issue I want to talk about today is distribution and demand. So like a lot of problems I've found in the plastic problem is, great, we can make all these recyclable materials, we can put them in all these packages, but if that material gets recycled and then I, as a consumer, throw it back into the landfill, it's a waste. And so the problem with, apparel, problem with plastics now becomes how do we create a more efficient supply chain and supply network? So I was hoping, you could explain with our audience maybe a little bit more about Zume, how it's using food analytics to create a more efficient supply chain for the end user.
Yeah, sure. I mean, what you're really describing is what we call a circular economy.
Okay.
Right. So you have reuse and or repurposing of products that stay in a circular economy. So an example of that would be look at packaging. So our packaging business, we're using ag waste. Okay. So historically what you would have is a farmer would go out and grow. They would have the products they would sell, and then they would have a bunch of ag waste coming out of it. A really example of that is sugarcane, as you talked about earlier, right? So the way sugarcane is produced is it's a big stalk, almost like corn. You cut down and then you squeeze juice out, and that's where sugar comes from. And then they throw this massive stalk into either a landfill or back into their farm, and it lets out methane gas, etc. And farmers they're not trying to be, it's not like they're intentionally trying to be bad. It's just that that's the intent. The intent of their growth was to create sugarcane, not to use the stalk. So we're like, wait a minute, all that energy, all that water, all the carbon emissions that were used to grow that sugarcane, we could actually use that and do something with it. So we're taking that stalk and actually producing molded fiber packaging, right? So, kind of like what you would see like in a bowl at Chipotle, that's molded fiber. It's everywhere. We can actually take that ag waste and make really high performing and cost effective molded fiber products. So you're taking something that would normally be waste and you're re-entering it and reusing it into the system. Okay. Now where that gets really exciting is, imagine if we could do that for other types of other products, or imagine that sugar company uses that same molded fiber for their packaging, right? So you have a full system where the sugar cane is used to grow the sugar. You're using the sugar cane fibrous stalk to make the packaging. The packaging comes back, it's composted in some type of municipal system, comes right back in, it's used to create soil and compost that then goes to grow the sugarcane again. So you have this perfectly closed loop system, and we need more systems like that. And they're starting to emerge. There's a really cool foundation called the Ellen MacArthur Foundation that specializes in this. It's obviously a conversation that's a little more advanced in Europe and some other economies, but the U.S. is starting to pick up on this. And so, that's just one of the business units that we're looking at. But ultimately, our whole goal is to create this circular economy across the food system, across very different types of elements and categories of the food system. So whether it's transportation, whether it's the food production itself, whether it's packaging, that's what we're trying to accomplish.
So let's take those different types and let's maybe break them down. I'm like really interested in this. What about like a retail, like a restaurant? How are you working with them to improve their efficiency and thus decrease their food waste?
Yeah, so it's there's a lot of technologies that are helping in kitchen remove food waste, and those are really exciting. What we're actually doing is more aggregated. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to provide them with solutions that helps us aggregate all that demand. So right now, one of the biggest problems is that all this food demand is super disaggregated, right? So you've got a bunch of different grocery stores, a bunch of different restaurants, and there's all this disaggregated information that's being shared between the farmer, distributor, or food distributors, and ultimately the end user, whether that's a consumer or a restaurant or a grocery store. And so what we're trying to do is give members of the food supply chain, we're trying to aggregate that information by giving them tech solutions that gives us data, right? So we call it demand signals, right? So what we try to do is say, okay, look, we know you have a restaurant. We know you're trying to do food delivery. We're going to try to provide you with a more efficient way of delivering your food. And in return, we're going to take that data, that aggregated data, and try to create a data lake. So we know, oh, actually, you know what? The Bay Area needs 400,000 tomatoes on any given day. And then work directly with farmers to help create real-time supply so that we cut out a lot of that inefficiency that happens throughout the supply chain. That's the kind of the large long-term vision for us. So in the short term, we're addressing sustainability issues around packaging. We're addressing them in some of the transportation stuff we're doing around batteries, which is really interesting. And then we're also trying to address this issue around food delivery. And food delivery is interesting because right now we don't have a direct solution that actually has a sustainable benefit. But we know that if we can get enough information and data around food delivery, we could have a huge aggregated impact, as I just described. And that's really fun and interesting, but it requires a ton of patience and it requires a ton of discipline because we want to have the immediate effect, which is what's exciting about our packaging business. But this larger, big strategy is something that requires us to continue to hammer away at every day and provide real-time solutions for our customers. It's really interesting is that like you ask what does leadership look like? And for us, we ourselves are an enabler. Like what we're saying is food companies across the supply chain, let's enable you to make great decisions for your business, but also for the planet or socially, whatever the outcome is you're looking for. You're really the champions of this. We're nothing more than a tech enabler to help you accomplish your goals. And, sometimes it's taking that step back and, in a humble way and providing those options for restaurants, for grocery stores, for food delivery companies, instead of us being kind of the ones that are getting a credit for actually accomplishing those goals. It's really up to them. It's really up to those companies. We just have to provide them with a technology that's scalable and cost effective, and then let them really do the rest.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't sell yourself short there, Keely. I mean, I think tech companies are, like you just said, cost efficient. And so, a company like yours, you're taking that long-term approach. It's very difficult. That's what I would consider, being a leader in this space, is you're knowingly going in with an intentional idea to, one, create impact, and two, say, hey, this is going to take a long time to do, and we're not about these short-term profits. But it's interesting though. So do you think that's something that a lot of business owners are struggling with in terms of not going towards that impact or sustainable route, is just the immediate returns or just the discipline maybe? What do you think it is?
Well, that's what's so interesting about food, right? Is that like, okay, so we talked about food waste, right? So food waste is a $990 billion problem globally, right? Again, it's the third largest emitter of carbon emissions. So it's like in aggregate, it's a humongous problem, right? But then when you go and you talk to the individual actors in the food system, they're all like real margin thin, right? They're all volume players. They have really low margins. So if you go to them and said, hey, you need to save the world by using sustainable packaging or by being more efficient in your distribution, but it's going to cost you 30% more, you're putting them in a pretty bad situation, right? So they don't have that margin to play with. So it really is up to us tech companies, other types of companies, to be able to like really drive scale and efficiencies for them so that they don't have to make that trade-off decision, right? Like not everyone is fortunate enough to be a Whole Foods where they're selling to people that, can afford the extra cost of organic food or sustainable packaging. If we're going to really address this problem, it needs to be done at scale and it needs to be available to everyone. And that means we have to make it available to all businesses regardless of their margins. So you asked this question around capitalism, like, businesses have to be profitable in order to survive. That's just the reality of it. And so what we want to do is we want to help companies avoid having to make that trade-off, right? We want to give them cost-effective, high-performing solutions that is a no-brainer for them to do because it is good for the environment. And there's other variables at play here. I mean, consumers are obviously starting to demand some of this, and governments are starting to regulate it. So, the food companies are caught in this really tough situation where they're being told what to do. They're trying to follow demand and being loyal to their own customers, but they don't always have the solutions readily available to actually address it without having serious repercussions to their business. So, that's where companies like Zume and others come in, and I think we can play a really important role.
I want to think like in a long-term perspective here, because I keep throwing around the term exponential, and exponential to me means how tech is emerging. Moore's law. It's either going to double in efficiency or halve your costs. And so in a futuristic world, and from like why I think this is so exciting, Keely, because being a young adult, we're ordering on Uber Eats, we're ordering on Postmates. There are pop-up taco shops that can sell me something and have it delivered, and it's fresh and it's ready to go, if I need it in seconds. I don't know if it's because I'm lazy. I don't know if it's because I grew up with it, or if it's, hey, I just don't want to move. But this is where, people my generation see food going and right. Restaurants going. Could you maybe explain the idea of your food carts and your food trucks that Zume is thinking about rolling out, and how they are implementing social principles, as well as the transformation, the longevity of a business solution like this?
Sure. Yeah. So remember I was talking earlier about this, like the long tail demand side of things, and us getting enough demand information to help drive better supply chain decisions down the supply chain. So our unique approach is using these mobile kitchens. So, don't sell yourself short, Kevin. Like, you're not lazy. You're a convenient seeker, like every human on the planet, right? Like there's one thing I can say with 100% conviction. We are convenient seekers, right? Like all humans do that, whether you're a millennial, a Gen Z, or a Gen X or older, or a boomer. Like we all do, and so, food delivery is here to stay. The economics of it right now are wonky. It's being subsidized in large part by some big companies, but it's here to stay. And it's, look, it's a pretty amazing thing. I can order a burrito from my favorite shop here in Oakland and have it delivered pretty quickly. I will say though that the convenience is not matched by the food experience today, right? So most likely you're going to get food delivered and it's not nearly going to be as great as an experience as you would have in a restaurant, right? It's probably going to be a little colder. I call it sweaty. Your food's a little sweaty. It's in the box. It's like, they're starting to get like some condensation, and like the burrito's kind of pushed to one corner of the box. And so, so our packaging strategy is informed by that. So we want to create packaging that helps food delivery create a more enhanced hospitality experience. An example of that is we just announced with Pizza Hut this new round box. I don't know if you saw that.
With the grids that you can cut the box.
Yeah. As a grid you can cut through, but then it's also, the pizza's actually elevated so that like the grease drops through. There's all this like science and physics and science behind kind of airflow. So the pizza stays warmer and crispier. It's just a better experience overall. So we can apply that to other types of foods as well. So packaging is trying to address that, but the mobile kitchens is really interesting too, right? So restaurants, as I said before, really kind of they're constrained by capital, right? And they have high risk. Restaurants fail all the time. So what we want to do is go to a restaurant owner and say, hey, look, we know using data, we know that let's just say Kevin's Meatball Shop is based you're in San Diego, right? So let's just say we know there's Kevin's Meatball Shop is based in La Jolla, right? And you've got a lot of demand in La Jolla, and you're able to service that sector or that area pretty easily with delivery within a 30-minute range. But let's just say Zume comes to you and says, hey, look, we actually know, Kevin, based on credit cards and credit card data and other data, that there's a huge demand for your meatball sandwiches in Chula Vista. And you're like, well, that's great, but I don't want to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars and time and risk to put a new restaurant out there. I don't really know. So we would come to you and say, hey, look, lease one of our mobile kitchens. You can go on a month-to-month lease. We'll put a kitchen out there, and we'll come every morning. We'll come to your store in La Jolla. We'll load up our mobile kitchen with all the right foods, and we'll put that mobile kitchen in Chula Vista, and we'll work with Uber Eats and DoorDash and Postmates and increase your delivery market by X amount. And then you're like, oh, and by the way, Carlsbad also has that demand. So now you have 3 working restaurants with 0 capital X risk, right? And you're there immediately, and you can test the markets. So that's super exciting for us. And we started this with our own pizza brand, Zume Pizza. We paid our people a fair living wage, because you can cut down a lot on the actual overall labor, total amount of labor by doing this, but you can pay people better. And then again, for us, the bigger play is getting this data and understanding all the ingredients, all the inputs that go into it, so we can start aggregating this information. And that's a long-term play for us, but we think that that's really important, and so it doesn't have the immediate benefit of the environmental return we necessarily see on some of our other businesses, but in aggregate, we think it will. But we also think we're really solving a big problem for restaurateurs. And ultimately, we're food lovers. We started our company in pizza. We love food. We know food has the power to make people's lives better and make the world better. And we want to make sure that food restaurateurs and others are successful. And it's pretty fun to see them be successful as a result. It's very rewarding. And the last part of this is food delivery is not going anywhere. It's a $35 billion business today. It's going to be a $365 billion business by 2030. It is here. Thanks to you and all the fine young millennials out there. No, just kidding. I mean, we're all doing it. And so if we're going to be a food business and a business that's trying to drive sustainability and drive a better food system, we better be paying attention to what's happening in food delivery. And, the US is actually behind on this. Europe, India, and China are like so far advanced. It's already taken off. So I think I've said it's probably, after the Green Revolution, it's probably the second biggest transformational thing in food over the last 100 years, because it is changing the way we eat. It's changing the way we socialize. Dude, they're building houses now, new apartments in San Francisco and China and other places without kitchens, right? So it is because
of food delivery.
Yeah. So people don't want to cook anymore. People just want to either take food out, either prepared foods out of a grocery store or convenience store, or a retail or another restaurant, or they want to get it delivered. And so it's hard to get your head around how transformational it is. Like, we're going to turn around in 10 years and be like, oh my God, what just happened? Right. I liken it to kind of like the Amazonification of retail. Right? You're like, oh, here's this company, they're selling books. Next thing you know, they own retail, right?
Right.
And that's exactly what's going to happen in food. And the good news is there's companies like Zume and others that are saying, okay, hold on. We know this is transforming the food system. We know this is going to have, major effects on restaurateurs and people. Let's try to start doing it the right way from the start.
Yeah.
And that's the intent for us.
See, yeah, exactly. And that's why I'm going back to the leadership things. I think you guys are looking forward and ahead on this and saying, hey, look, we produce enough food on this world to feed everybody, but it's just not being distributed properly. How can we play our role in this, which I think is really interesting. But I like your meatball example, Keely. Let's stick on that example really quick. So what else? What else can you do for me? If I was a meatball restaurant, I mean, what about my beef intake, where I'm getting my suppliers from? What about, I mean, I make a mean marinara sauce. I'm looking for my tomatoes. What about shrinkage? Do you track shrinkage from geographically from a tomato supplier in Mexico versus one in Chula Vista? What are some other things that you could help my business out with in terms of how to use the food analytics?
Yeah, I mean, we're certainly not going to get in the business of telling what people should and should not eat. There's a lot of people that say like to stop eating meat. I mean, clearly there's a case to be made for addressing climate change through reduced meat production and intake.
I'm just talking normal food analytics, just like how do I, I mean, how can you help me?
All of the above. I mean, what's cool is when we get the right amount of data and demand information, we can help farmers with the right type of technology. So imagine we have a precision farming system, right? So indoor growing, right? And we're growing tomatoes. And right now that tomato grower is getting information from a bunch of different distributors. They're aggregating and saying, look, we need to grow 300,000 tomatoes this year. They're going to come in at different times. We don't know exactly when. We have a general sense of when the demand is going to come in, right? There may be more tomatoes eaten during the summer, with a nice variety. I don't know.
Right.
But they can't get specific. If we get enough data, aggregated data, we can actually go and say to a farmer at precision farming in a greenhouse and say, dude, we know that you're going to need 100,000 tomatoes on September 22nd. And we know exactly where they're going to go. So this is when you need to start the plant. This is how much water you're going to need, how much energy you're going to need, how much nutrients and inputs you're going to get in. And it's going to be not just precision farming, it's going to be coupled with precision analytics and predictive analytics. And that is where it gets really interesting. So then we can help, to your point, really manage inventory, supply chains in ways that we never could before because the information has been disaggregated. And that gets super, super exciting. And then you think about the use of those agricultural products across the suite of products, right? So let's just say we have tomatoes and we grow tomatoes and those tomatoes are consumed in food, in some kind of food products, whether it's canned tomatoes for pizza sauce or a nice salsa, whatever you want to do. And then you have this stock, tomatoes are grown on stock. Well, what do you do with that stock? There's a ton of stock. It's a long form fiber. We can actually use that tomato stock to grow packaging and to make packaging with, right? So you start finding all these connections, data connections that didn't exist before. And that's where it gets really powerful and impactful, and that gets me very excited, but it's a long-term play, but it's the way you have to be thinking about these systems. Our CEO likes to talk about systems designing and building a company smart from the start in being a systems thinker, right? So, and the reason he feels compelled to do that is because of climate change and the urgency around that problem. So he's like, Keely, Amazon was built over 25 years. We don't have the luxury of that. We have to be designing and thinking about this company in a systematic way, deliberately from the start, because we have to address these problems immediately, right? And so it's that sense of purpose and urgency, which is really a big part of the Zume ethos.
I have a question. I was speaking with a good friend of mine who runs I think a wholesaler distribution center in the Pacific Northwest. And I asked him, if they were to have something like Zume, so I guess maybe for you is when you go into a wholesaler like that or into a restaurant, no matter what it is, if they're already using a predictive tracking service, would they have to switch to yours, or could they feed that data and maybe do just crowdsource data into your software to then provide them with some solutions?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on who it is and what they're doing. I mean, I don't think the predictive analytics that exists today is all that effective, or we'd be solving a lot of these problems already.
Yeah, true.
So, the average produce goes through 12 steps before it actually gets to the consumer.
I didn't know that.
And the reason that is because there's not shared information, right? So it's super disaggregated. So someone might have predictive analytics within their unique little ecosystem, but no one's looking at this holistically and really understanding all the big pieces in a way that's going to have impact at scale. And that's what we're setting out to do.
A holistic approach to the food supply and distribution system. Interesting. Okay. All right, Keely, I'm interested. I was looking at some stats earlier today, and you mentioned 2030. 2030 is when the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are set or are due, I guess.
Yeah.
And going on their website, they said, I think it was, do I have the stat right? Yeah, 815 million people don't know where their next food or their next meal is coming.
Yeah.
And 20% of that 815 million are in urban areas.
Yeah.
Where do you see Zume's role in that food insecurity issue?
It's funny you ask. It's not funny you ask. It's terribly sad that you ask, but I guess it's appropriate that you're asking. So interestingly enough, what ultimately motivated our founder was this food insecurity and political security issue. So, and a lot of it was driven not by hunger, but hunger is going to be the hunger stats you're looking at today are going to pale in comparison to tomorrow because of climate change, right? So if you think about the crisis on the United States southern border today, a lot of that's being driven by food insecurity issues in the highlands of Central America. Arab Spring, right, was driven in large part, in some parts at least, by a spike in wheat prices, right? So we're already seeing massive amounts of exodus and people movement and political insecurity driven by hunger and food issues, right? And climate is only going to exacerbate that issue, right? And I can't even remember off the top of my head, but if you look at something like 150 million people are going to be put at risk of being put out of their homes. And by the way, and not in rural areas, in urban areas like Jakarta and other places within the next 10 to 15 years because of climate change. That is so frightening, right? I think at one point there was in World War II, there was 10 million people that were displaced. That number is going to look nothing. It's going to pale in comparison to what we're going to see around climate change. So this hunger, food security, and political security issue is one that I actually think it's going to be the ultimate driver of the world addressing climate change, not food, not fixing the environment or saving Mother Earth, which in itself is a good enough reason. But I think it's going to be these other major political drivers. I just hope that we get ahead of it quickly enough with real political, not just tech solutions to help address it, but real political solutions, because when it hits, it's going to be really sad. There's going to be so many unfortunate people that are going to be struggling and starving, and there's going to be war and really horrible things happening. And I don't want to be a downer. I think it's just the reality of what we're facing. But I'm also really optimistic. I think humanity has faced really dark times before, right? Pre-Enlightenment, there were pretty dark times, right? We've all seen movies and shows about what the world and read books about what life was like pre-Enlightenment. And I think my hope is that we're kind of coming into this new Enlightenment period where we're putting, the environment at the forefront because we're understanding the social implications of it.
Interesting. Okay, so what maybe cross-sector partnerships or what government intervention would incentivize your industry to really produce these sustainable foods? What's the government's role in this?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a ton of levers that the government could use to make change. I'm not really hopeful or right now optimistic about government being a solution. I think that private industry is going to step up in a big way on this because I think there's a ton, in the absence of government intervention, I think that there's tons of private opportunity to address this. Certainly, putting a price on carbon across multiple industries would be helpful. We've seen it a little bit in energy generation and transportation, but I think we're going to have to do it across a wider swath of industries to put a true to truly capture some of those shadow costs that exist in the marketplace, whether they're health related or environmentally related, or as we talk about geopolitical and national security related. It's interesting. HR McMaster, who's a 4-star general, he's actually one of our advisors to our company, came and spoke to us, and he talked about this. He said, the military gets this. The military understands he's trying to convince the military that they're actually going to be in the future. The military is actually going to be in the food growing industry, because that's going to be the single greatest threat to their to national security, not just for the United States but across the globe. Right? Is food insecurity. He's like, the military leadership gets it. They understand. So they're studying this. They're really looking hard around food insecurity issues. So, that's one way where the government actually could step in is in it being driven by national security. But, in a place like the United States where we have the resources to do that, that's fortunate. But in other places, there's going to have to be other types of solutions. And it's interesting because food waste is different in the United States than it is in, say, like sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa, most of the food waste occurs either on the farm or in transportation, because they don't have great cold transportation, right? So, but in the U.S. it's different. It's actually, most of the food waste is actually happening kind of further upstream, or pardon me, further downstream. It's happening more kind of at the restaurant, grocery, transportation, and then consumer level, because we have it in abundance, right? Sadly. Whereas Africa and other, developing places have a totally different set of problems, and will require different policy solutions.
Yeah, I think you said a couple of good points too. It's like how climate change is impacting like this food supply, especially with all these droughts in the Middle East, especially. I think you'd mentioned 150 million. I think the number I had was like 50. Maybe it was 150 million refugees by the year 2050 due to war and conflict, and food being a big part of that, people not being able to get their next meal. And when you think of history, say, the climate's always been changing. Yes, it has, but this enhances it. The one, part of being on the podcast and thinking about capitalism as a system and how it can evolve and update, sometimes I like to be a conspirator, Keely. And the conspirator I have here is there's an ancient city in Mexico I studied a while back in school, and it was called Teotihuacan. And this is the civilization of Mexico. It's one of the largest cities in Mexico, 300, 500 AD, and had a ton of people in there. No one knows what happened to it. To this day, no one really knows. But there's a ton of buildings there. It seems like there could have been an uprising. But the one consistency every single archaeologists have found is that they cut down all the trees in the area to build and manifest all the buildings and create all these fires. So without the trees and without the agriculture, they were not able to sustain that population, thus making everyone flee and migrate to different cities. It's happened before, people. It's happening again. It's happening right now. And I think you also said, until it hits, I don't know if we're ever going to notice if something hits. It's already happening. We live in a bubble.
Yeah.
It's
the Al Gore frog boiling metaphor, right?
What's that?
You never heard Al Gore's, Vice President Gore's frog metaphor? Like, a frog doesn't know it's boiling because the temperature is rising.
Oh, right.
Right. And they're in a pot, and they ultimately, succumb to the heat, but they don't know it because it's happening in such kind of like minor steps that you don't know it until it's too late. And I definitely think we're headed there. But I really am optimistic. I think the human capacity for addressing problems is like none other. Is there going to be pain? Of course, there's going to be pain, and I hope we can minimize that across the globe. But I really do believe that there are going to be solutions, and I think they're going to be driven in large part by technology. And technology gets a bad rub, right? I don't think we as an industry have done a great job of kind of like selling its virtues, because I think some other ways, but I mean, tech can really be part of the solution if we're smart. And maybe the folks in Teotihuacan, maybe they found another tech solution that took them to another place. You never know. And I was a Latin American studies major at undergrad at Cal Berkeley, so I want to look more into that. That sounds really cool.
Well, Keely, I think you hit on a great point. This is what I always like to ask people, especially in tech. Is it a tool or a weapon? And how? And so the basis of that premise, every single time I ask that question, you just get down to, well, it's a leadership problem. How is it going to be used? And it seems like your organization is realizes that problem and is addressing those needs. So the last question I have for you, Keely, is what is your definition of a real leader?
A real leader to me is someone who's both authentic, to have the effect that they're looking for on people, but ultimately it's someone that helps people, society, organizations reach their full potential.
I like that.
And that's how I try to live every day. I can't say that I'm great at it every day, but and everyone has their own kind of mechanism for that. I happen to be in the business of kind of selling ideas, right? I mean, that's kind of what I do in my job. So I try to inspire people to reach their full potential with really meaningful and easy to understand ideas, and try to come at it honestly, and but other leaders have a different way of doing it. But I think if everyone spent their time thinking about how to help others around them reach their full potential, imagine what kind of society we'd be in.
Oh yeah, exactly. Well, Keely, I appreciate your time coming here on the Real Leaders podcast. Talked about a lot today. Talked about the systems of capitalism, how Zume's playing a vital role in that, increasing efficiency, supply, distribution. Talked about my meatball shop today. I might even open one up in La Jolla. Who knows? It seems like it's pretty possible and eventual with Zume out here helping people out. And then lastly, Keely talked a little about government intervention and policy, and how climate change is disrupting the food industry, how military leaders are taking a stance on this to supply their own soldiers. Then lastly, followed it up with your definition of a real leader. Any last words today, Keely?
No, I'm just really honored to be a part of this, Kevin. I thought you asked some great questions, and I love the Real Leaders media platform. I think you guys are doing a great job, and thanks for continuing the conversation about what leadership looks like.
Well, we appreciate you. All right, everybody. For Keely Wachs, the VP of Communications and Impact at Zume, I'm Kevin Edwards, asking you to go out there, bring people together, and always keep it real, folks.